1 year ago, Karina crossed the Ashen Ridge, half dead and nameless. Today, 3 separate pack delegations had requested audiences with the Iron Fang Luna before breakfast. The realm had not forgotten what happened at the stone table. If anything, it had been paying closer attention ever since, watching the twins grow with the quiet, collective intensity of a world that understood, without being told directly, that something unprecedented was developing inside the Iron Fang compound, and that the shape of the next decade would be determined largely by how it unfolded. Zane and Rael were 13 months old and already the most discussed children in living pack memory. Draven had quietly doubled the compound's security without making it visible. Rena had reorganized the intelligence network around a single priority. Sable spent her mornings in the Eastern Garden and her evenings making notes in a language only she could read. It was, by any reasonable measure, a period of extraordinary, hard-won stability, which was precisely when the messenger arrived. Karina was in the Eastern Garden with her tea, watching Rael attempt to redistribute the contents of a flower bed, with the focused determination of someone who considered this urgent work, when the Iron Fang's fastest scout came through the gate at a pace that said everything before a single word was spoken. She set her cup down. She did not hurry. She had learned in the year since the summit that the quality of her stillness in a crisis set the temperature of every room she walked into afterward. The message was brief. The Ashbourne and Veldthorn packs were 4 days from open war. Every allied pack in the realm would be pulled in behind it. The council had met through the night and reached a unanimous conclusion. There was only one bridge, and she was already looking up. The realm is calling her back, and this time, she isn't running towards survival. She is riding towards something far more powerful. Do you think Karina is ready for what comes next? Or has the hardest battle of her life been quietly waiting this whole time? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story has lived in your chest the way we hope it has, help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. 1 subscribe, 1 share, and we get there together. Chapter 1. The briefing lasted 2 hours and left very little room for optimism. Rena ran it with her characteristic economy. No editorializing, no softening of the numbers. Just the clean and unsparing geometry of a situation that had been deteriorating for 3 generations and had finally, in the last 2 weeks, begun its terminal descent. She laid the maps across the strategy table and walked them through the fault lines with the pointer she reserved for situations she considered genuinely serious, which meant she had used it perhaps 4 times in the past year. The Ashbourne and Veldthorn packs had shared a border for a century and hated each other for most of it. The original dispute was territorial, a river valley that both packs claimed as ancestral land, rich enough in resources to be worth fighting for, and ambiguous enough in the historical record to sustain 3 generations of lawyers, elders, and failed mediations. But territorial disputes that survive 3 generations stop being about territory. They become about identity, about the specific load-bearing story each pack tells itself about who it is and who wronged them and what justice is owed. By the time a wound calcifies into identity, the original injury is almost beside the point. What remains is the architecture of grievance, and that is a far more dangerous thing to dismantle. 4 days ago, an Ashbourne patrol had crossed the contested valley line. Whether deliberately or by navigational error, was itself a matter of violent disagreement. and a Veldthorn boundary wolf had been killed in the confrontation that followed. That was the match. The kindling had been drying for decades. Every allied pack in the realm held treaties that would activate the moment open war was formally declared. The resulting chain of obligation would pull 14 packs into the conflict within a week. Obsidian Crest sat at the geographic center of it, bordered by both Ashbourne and Veldthorn territory, treaty-bound to both, and therefore positioned with the particular precariousness of a keystone that everyone needed to hold, but no one had asked whether it could bear the weight. Javier, Rena noted without inflection, had sent 3 diplomatic communications in the past 48 hours and received no substantive response from either warring pack. His neutrality, which had been an asset, was becoming a liability. Both packs read his silence as complicity with the other. He was running out of time to be useful and beginning to run the risk of simply being consumed. Draven listened to all of it without moving. He asked 4 questions, each one surgical, each one aimed at a different load-bearing assumption in the crisis, and received 4 answers that confirmed what the maps already suggested. There was no military solution. A show of force from any direction would be read as an alliance declaration and accelerate exactly what everyone was trying to prevent. The Allied network was a web, and the web was vibrating, and the only way to stop a web from tearing was to find the center and hold it still. It was at this precise moment that the strategy room door opened and Sable walked in. She did not knock. She never knocked. She navigated the compound with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood its layout through entirely different means than sight, and she arrived at things, conversations, moments, rooms, with a timing so consistent that Draven had long since stopped questioning it and simply made space. She found her way to the edge of the table. She stood with her hands folded and her white eyes aimed at the middle distance that only she could access. She listened to the silence that her arrival had created for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "The bridge must stand between them. You know what that means." 11 words, and they ended the strategic discussion as completely as if she had folded the maps herself and put them away. The room was very quiet. Karina stood at the far end of the table and felt the words move through her with the particular quality of a thing recognized rather than learned. The way you recognize a road you have traveled in the dark. Not by seeing it clearly, but by the specific feeling of the ground beneath your feet. She had been unknowingly building toward this her entire life. Every trial she survived in this compound. Every test Rena designed. Every evening Draven spent reading the old texts to her by low light. Every choice she made to become something rather than simply escape something. It had all been, without her knowing, preparation, not for her own healing, for this. She looked at the maps for a long moment, at the fault lines, at the geographic center where Obsidian Crest sat like a keystone under impossible pressure, at the specific shape of the space that needed a bridge. Then she looked at Draven. "We need to contact Cruz," she said. He was already reaching for the communications line. Chapter 2. Cruz delivered the message in the way he delivered all things of consequence, simply, completely, without editorializing, and then stood in the center of Javier's study and waited with the particular patience of a man who had learned, over 7 years of service, that his alpha needed space between receiving information and responding to it, and that the quality of the response was directly proportional to the size of that space. Javier stood at the window, the same window he had stood at a year ago when Cruz brought him the prophecy text. The same view, the pack grounds, the outer gate, the tree line of the territory he had ruled since he was 24 years old, with a certainty so complete it had never once occurred to him to question its foundations. He had spent the last year quietly dismantling and rebuilding those foundations, mostly alone, partly with Cruz, in the indirect oblique way that two men who have worked alongside each other long enough sometimes manage to discuss enormous things without ever naming them directly. He had not rebuilt his political alliances first, which would have been the instinctive move, the strategic move, the move that the Javier of 2 years ago would have made before the study door had fully closed. He had done something harder and less visible and considerably less comfortable. He had tried, with the grinding and unglamorous consistency of a man with no talent for it, to become someone whose alliances were worth having. He had read the prophecy of the dual soul text 14 times. He had counted in the way you count things you are trying to understand, rather than simply memorize. He had read it the first time looking for the loophole, the second time looking for the counter-argument, the third time with the dawning and profoundly unwelcome understanding that there was no loophole, and every subsequent time with the slow and reluctant attention of a man learning a language he had spent his entire adult life refusing to study. He had been to the Iron Fang compound once, stood in that room with Zane in his arms, and felt the child's presence move through him like a hand smoothing a crumpled document, not erasing what was written, but making it legible. Rael had looked at him with those silver eyes and seen something Javier had spent 36 years making sure no one ever saw, and the extraordinary thing, the thing he had turned over in the privacy of his own thoughts 100 times since, was that Rael had not judged it, had simply seen it, acknowledged it, and looked at him afterward with the same steady, open attention as before, as though what he had found underneath the performance was not a disappointment, but simply a person. He had written one honest letter in his life. He had received one back. He kept it in the inside drawer of his desk, which was not a thing he would ever acknowledge to another living soul, and the fold lines had gone soft in the way of paper that has been handled often and carefully. Karina's reply was not warm, and it was not forgiving, and it was not the letter he might have wished for in a more self-serving version of his own imagination. It was exact, and it was clear, and it offered him something more durable than forgiveness. It offered him a functional future, contingent on his willingness to earn it incrementally, one honest choice at a time. He had been trying. This was the moment that trying became costly, because cooperating with Karina, opening Obsidian Crest to the Iron Fang Luna, publicly positioning himself as her ally rather than her adversary, standing beside the woman he had rejected before the entire realm and lending her his pack's authority and geographic position to prevent a war, was not a private act of conscience. There was no version of it that happened quietly. Every pack in the Allied network would see it. Every alpha who had watched the Blood Moon ceremony and the summit, and had formed their assessments accordingly, would be required to revise those assessments in real time. His cooperation would be read correctly as an admission, not spoken, not formalized, but legible to anyone paying attention, that he had been wrong about Karina, about strength, about what an alpha's mark was actually for. 36 years of a particular understanding of himself stood on one side of this moment. On the other side, stood a river valley filling with blood, 14 packs on a collision course, and a woman who had survived everything he had put her through and was now, without bitterness and without obligation, offering him the chance to be part of the solution to a problem his own choices had helped create. He thought about Zane's hands, small and certain, redistributing the weight of the world with the calm authority of someone who had never been taught that the world was supposed to be heavy. He thought about the fold lines on Karina's letter. He thought about Cruz, standing in the center of the room for the past 4 minutes without saying a word. Because Cruz had always known that the quality of a response was proportional to the size of the space given to it, and had given him exactly as much as he needed. Javier turned from the window. "Tell her," he said, "that Obsidian Crest's gates are open. She has my full cooperation, publicly, on record, without conditions." He paused and then added the 4 words that cost him everything his old self had been built on, and felt, in the spending, like the first honest currency he had ever used. "Tell her I'm sorry." Cruz held his gaze for one long moment. Then he nodded once, not with surprise, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, steady acknowledgement of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular answer and is deeply, privately relieved it finally arrived. He left without another word. Javier turned back to the window. The pack grounds, the outer gate, the territory that was still his, that had always been his, and that felt, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, like something he might actually deserve. Chapter 3? She had ridden this road before in the dark, bleeding and burning, with nothing ahead of her but a border. She wasn't sure she would survive, and nothing behind her but a life that had already decided to end without her permission. She remembered the specific quality of that night, the cold, the way each step required a separate and individual act of will, the sound of the pack celebration still audible long after it should have faded, following her down the road like something that refused to let her go cleanly. This was not that ride. The morning was clear and unhurried, the autumn light coming in at a low angle that turned the tree line amber and made the road ahead look like something out of the old illuminated texts Draven kept in the compound library. Karina rode at the center of a small escort, 8 wolves, chosen for discretion over display, with Draven on her left and Rena a half-length back on her right, in the formation they had settled into so naturally over the past year that it no longer required any conscious arrangement. They simply arrived in it, the way people who have spent enough time together arrive at a shared rhythm without discussing the tempo. The twins were behind them, 2 hours back, traveling with Sable in a protected convoy that would hold position until Karina sent the signal. She had made that decision herself, over Rena's initial logistical objection, and had explained it simply. She would not walk into Obsidian Crest for the first time in a year, using her sons as armor. Whatever happened at those gates would happen on its own terms, between the people who needed to be there for it. Zane and Raul would arrive when the ground was ready to receive them, not before. She had learned in the year since the summit the profound strategic difference between power displayed and power held in reserve. The latter was always more authoritative. The road passed through the borderlands that she had crossed in darkness 14 months ago. The same frost-hardened ground, the same ash trees growing at their wrong angles, the same atmospheric weight of a place that had witnessed something significant and retained the impression of it. She looked at it without flinching, without the complicated pull of grief or rage, or the phantom ache of the severed bond that had driven her across it the first time. She looked at it the way you look at a scar that has healed cleanly, with the quiet, factual acknowledgement of something that happened, that cost you, and that is finished. Draven said nothing for most of the ride. He had a gift for that. For companionable silence that communicated presence without demand, that managed to be both completely unobtrusive and entirely steady. She was aware of him beside her the way she was aware of her own heartbeat. Constant. Orienting. The thing you notice most clearly when you imagine its absence. Once, somewhere in the middle stretch of the road, he reached across the space between their horses and set his hand briefly over hers on the reins. Not a gesture of reassurance. She didn't need reassurance, and he knew it. Simply contact. Simply, I am here, and I see what this is, and you are not moving through it alone. She turned her hand over under his for a moment, and then they rode on. Rena, behind them, looked at the tree line and said nothing, which was its own form of respect. The outer gate of Obsidian Crest appeared at mid-morning, and Javier was already there. Not with an honor guard, not with his beta council arranged behind him in a show of pack authority. Not with the careful political staging she had watched him deploy her entire life, with the practiced ease of a man who understood that presentation was itself a form of argument. He was simply standing at the gate in a dark coat, with his hands at his sides, alone, the way a person stands when they have decided that the thing they are doing does not require an audience. Karina brought her horse to a stop 10 feet from him, and they looked at each other across that distance, in the clear autumn light. It was quiet. It was human. It carried the full accumulated weight of a blood moon ceremony and a severed bond, and an ashen ridge and a summit, and one honest letter with soft fold lines. Carried all of it without requiring any of it to be spoken, because some weights are communicated most completely in silence between people who both know exactly what they are not saying. Javier's eyes moved briefly to Draven, and something passed between the two men that was not warmth and was not hostility, but was the particular sober acknowledgement of two people who exist on opposite sides of the same woman's story and have both, at different costs and in different ways, arrived at the truth of it. Then Javier looked back at Karina. "Welcome to Obsidian Crest," he said, quietly, without ceremony, like a man who has finally learned the difference between an occasion and a moment, and understands that this is the latter. He turned and led them through the gate. Karina rode into the pack house grounds and looked around at the place that had shaped her and discarded her, and that she had spent 14 months building a life magnificent enough to make the discarding irrelevant. It was smaller than she remembered. The grounds that had loomed so large in the geography of her worst memories were simply grounds, well-maintained, functional, belonging to a pack doing its quiet work of existing. The pack house itself was tidier than it had been under Selena's tenure, and somehow less performative, as if the architecture had exhaled. She noticed, without comment, that it felt more honest than she had ever known it to be. She thought that was probably the most accurate measure of how much had changed. Chapter 4. The Ashbourne Alpha arrived first. His name was Garrett, broad-shouldered, gray-templed, with the kind of face that had started out handsome and been rearranged by decades of leadership into something more interesting and considerably less approachable. He came with 6 advisors and a leather satchel of documentation so comprehensive, it suggested a legal team that had been preparing for exactly this summit for considerably longer than the crisis warranted, which told Karina something useful about how long the Ashbourne had been anticipating the moment they would need to make their case in front of witnesses. He acknowledged Javier with the minimal courtesy of a man who needed the venue and was prepared to pay for it with exactly that much goodwill and no more. He acknowledged Draven with the careful neutrality of someone who had done his intelligence work and understood that the Iron Fang Alpha's presence here was not incidental. He acknowledged Karina with a fractional pause, the involuntary recalibration of a man encountering something he had been briefed on, but had not quite believed until this moment, and then settled his delegation at the east side of the long table with the territorial efficiency of people who had been fighting over boundaries long enough to claim any available space by instinct. The Veldthorn Alpha arrived 20 minutes later. Her name was Isadora, and she was nothing like Garrett in the way that the other side of a war is never like its opposite. Where he was broad and deliberate, she was precise and kinetic, moving through the pack house entrance with the compressed energy of someone who had been running on controlled fury for so long it had become indistinguishable from her natural state. She was perhaps 50, with sharp features and eyes the color of winter bark that moved across the assembled room in a single rapid assessment that missed nothing. Her delegation was smaller than Garrett's. 4 people, each one chosen, Karina suspected, for competence rather than optics. Isadora's acknowledgement of Karina was different from Garrett's. Longer, more direct. The look of a woman who had heard the story and was reserving judgment on whether it was relevant until she had more data. Karina received both assessments without expression and filed them carefully. The summit opened with the formalities that all summits required: the neutral elder's reading of the convening terms, the establishment of record, the confirmation that all parties had agreed to the ground rules of engagement. Javier presided over the opening, with a quiet competence that Karina had not expected and then immediately understood she should have. He had spent a year rebuilding, and part of what he had rebuilt was this: the ability to hold a room not through dominance, but through genuine authority, which was a different instrument entirely, and one he was, apparently, still learning to play, but no longer pretending he already knew. Then Garrett spoke. He spoke for 40 minutes. His case was thorough, historically documented, and delivered with the measured conviction of a man who had internalized his pack's grievance so completely that it had become inseparable from his own identity. The River Valley. The original boundary agreement signed 3 generations ago, the 17 documented incursions, the economic impact, the lives. He laid it all on the table with the careful precision of someone arranging evidence rather than making an argument, because the evidence, in his view, was so complete that argument was almost superfluous. He was not wrong about the facts. Karina noted that clearly. He was not manufacturing grievance or distorting history. The Ashbourne had been wronged, repeatedly and documentably, and the wrongness had compounded over time in the way that unaddressed wounds compound, not linearly, but exponentially, each new incident landing on the unhealed tissue of every previous one. Isadora responded for 35 minutes. Her presentation was less documented and more visceral. She spoke about what the territorial loss had meant to the Veldthorn's sense of itself, about the specific communities displaced, about the children who had grown up understanding their pack's identity as one of perpetual siege. She was precise where Garrett had been comprehensive, and she was, in her own way, equally not wrong. 2 hours of legitimate grievance laid on a table in front of witnesses. Karina listened to all of it. She did not take notes. She did not confer with Draven or Rena, both of whom sat beside her with the attentive stillness of people who understood that their role in this room was to be present and to wait. She listened with the particular quality of attention she had developed across 14 months of learning what she actually was. Not the surface content, not the legal arguments, not the documented facts, but the architecture underneath all of it. The emotional load-bearing structure that the territorial dispute had been built on top of, like a house constructed over a foundation crack that everyone could feel in the floors, but no one had ever agreed to expose. She mapped it carefully. The Ashbournes' wound was about legitimacy, the need to be seen as a pack whose claims were real and whose history was respected rather than managed. The Veldthorns' wound was about survival, the fear, 3 generations deep, that their identity as a pack would be slowly eroded until nothing distinctly theirs remained. 2 different wounds, 2 different hungers. A territorial dispute that was the visible symptom of both and the solution to neither. She sat with that understanding for a long moment after Isadora finished speaking, while the room resettled into the particular silence of a space waiting to find out what comes next. Then she placed both hands flat on the table and stood up. She did not speak immediately. She let the room come to her, let the attention of every person present arrive and settle and become complete. Garrett looked at her with the careful assessment of a man prepared to be unimpressed. Isadora looked at her with the winterbark eyes that were still reserving judgment. Javier, at the head of the table, looked at her with the quiet, steady attention of a man who knew exactly what she was capable of and was simply waiting for the room to find out. The silence was total, and in it, before a single word had been spoken, something shifted. Some atmospheric change that moved through the assembled wolves the way Zane's presence moved through a room below the level of sound, below the level of thought, in the register where bodies know things before minds catch up. Karina took a breath and began. The bridge has spoken, and the realm will never be the same. But here is what we want to know. When Isadora set that document down, was it Karina's words that moved her, or was it Rael's silver eyes seeing straight through to the truth Garrett had been hiding for 30 years? Which moment broke the wall? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story has lived in your chest the way we hope it has, hit like, hit subscribe, and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. You are the reason we keep telling these stories. Chapter 5. She did not begin with the river valley. She did not begin with maps or documents or the carefully constructed legal framework that both delegations had spent the morning deploying with the exhausting thoroughness of people who had been preparing their cases so long the preparation had become its own kind of prison. She set none of that on the table. She simply stood, with her hands no longer pressed flat on the surface, but relaxed at her sides, and looked at Garrett first, then Isadora, with the direct and unhurried attention of a woman who had learned, at significant personal cost, the difference between the wound and the story being told about it. "I'm not going to argue the boundary claim," she said. "You've both done that more thoroughly than I could, and you're both right about your own history, which is precisely why you're 4 days from a war that will kill people who had nothing to do with the decisions that started it." The room was very still, I want to tell you about a night 2 years ago, she said, not because it's relevant to your boundary dispute, because it's relevant to what boundary disputes actually cost. Not the packs, not the territories, but the people standing inside them who learn from the time they're old enough to understand anything that the most important thing about who they are is who they're against. She told them, not the full story, not the ceremony, not the crossing, not the trials. She told them the architecture of it, the specific way a person internalizes a war they were born into, until the war's logic becomes indistinguishable from their own thinking. The way she had spent years measuring her worth through Javier's definitions, not because she was weak, but because she had been standing inside a system that offered no other currency and had never thought to question whether the system itself was the problem. She told them what it felt like to have the ground of your entire identity removed in a single public moment. And here, without announcing it, she let her eyes move briefly to Javier, who held her gaze with the still, undefended attention of a man who had earned the right to be in the room for this by spending a year learning to bear exactly this kind of truth without looking away. She told them what it cost, not to her pride, to her body, to her capacity to trust her own perception of reality, to the future she might have built if the war's logic hadn't been load-bearing in the structure of everything around her. She told them this without self-pity and without performance, in the same tone you use to describe weather: observable, factual, real. The wound you're both carrying, she said, looking between Garrett and Isadora, is legitimate. I am not standing here to tell you that 3 generations of grievance is invented or disproportionate, or that the right answer is to simply decide to feel differently. I know what it is to carry a legitimate wound. I know how completely it can organize a life around itself until the wound and the life are indistinguishable. She paused. I also know what it costs the children. She let that land. Not your children specifically. Every child born into a pack whose identity is structured around an unresolved injury. Children who learn the boundary dispute before they learn their own names. Who grow up understanding that their pack's survival and their pack's wound are the same thing, and who therefore cannot imagine a version of survival that doesn't require maintaining the wound. Because a wound that heals takes the identity with it. And that is the most terrifying thing of all. It was at this moment that the door at the far end of the room opened quietly. Sable came in first, navigating the space with her customary unhurried certainty. Behind her, carried by 2 of the Iron Fang's most trusted wolves, were Zane and Rael. They were 14 months old. They were small and silver-eyed and entirely themselves. Zane, with his father's watchful stillness. Rael, with his mother's particular quality of open, undefended attention. They were set down gently near the edge of the room, and they stood, with the slightly wide-legged stability of children still negotiating their relationship with upright locomotion, and looked at the assembled summit with the uncomplicated curiosity of people encountering a room full of adults engaged in something whose stakes they could feel, but whose specifics they had no investment in. Zane's presence did what it always did. It moved through the room below the level of sound. That frequency, that orientation, the feeling of standing at the center of something rather than the edge. Karina watched it happen in real time. The slight loosening of held breath, the almost imperceptible drop in the collective tension that had been building since Garrett's delegation arrived that morning. Three of the Veldthorn advisors looked at each other with the uncertain expression of people whose bodies had just done something their minds hadn't authorized. Rahl looked at Garrett. He looked at him with those silver eyes, not performing, not projecting, simply receiving with the acute emotional attunement that had been making adults deeply uncomfortable since he was 8 months old, and responded to what was actually underneath the Ashbourne Alpha's 3-generation position. Not the legal argument, not the documented grievance, the thing beneath all of that. The fear. The specific exhausted fear of a man who had inherited a wound he didn't create and had spent his entire leadership trying to resolve it through the only method he had been given, escalation, and had known for years, in the private place beneath the conviction, that it wasn't working. Something in Garrett's face changed. Not dramatically, not with the clean punctuation of a revelation clearly marked. Slowly, the way ice changes at the first suggestion of a temperature shift. A subtle rearrangement of the muscles around his eyes, a fraction of softening at the jaw, the almost invisible collapse of something that had been held rigid for a very long time. Karina saw it happen. She did not name it. She simply continued. "What becomes possible," she said quietly, "when you choose to be a bridge instead of a weapon, is this." She gestured without grandeur at the twins, at the room, at the fact of all of them in it together, still talking, still present, 4 days from a war that had not yet started and did not have to. Not the absence of the wound, the decision that the wound does not get to write the next generation's story. The room was completely silent. Isadora looked at the twins for a long moment. Then she looked down at the territorial claim document in front of her, the comprehensive, meticulously prepared, 3-generation summation of the Veldthorns' case, representing decades of legal work and the accumulated grief of a pack that had been fighting to exist on its own terms since before she was born. She picked it up, held it for a moment with both hands, and set it down, not destroyed, not conceded, simply set aside with the quiet, voluntary deliberateness of a person making a choice that the wound would have made impossible yesterday, and that something in this room, something silver-eyed and 14 months old and entirely without agenda, had made, if not easy, then at least imaginable. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Chapter 6. The agreements were not signed that evening. That was important. The distinction between a crisis prevented and a resolution completed, between the moment a war stops being inevitable and the long, unglamorous work of building something in the space where the war would have been. Karina had been careful about that in the closing hour of the summit, careful not to let the emotional momentum of Isadora's gesture carry anyone into commitments made in the heat of a shifted feeling, rather than the considered light of actual deliberation. She had seen enough of how wounds worked to know that the moment after the wall comes down is not the moment to start construction. It is the moment to simply stand in the opening and let both sides remember how to breathe. So they had agreed to a process. A mediated boundary review, structured and formally witnessed, with Karina and Draven facilitating, and a timeline that was realistic rather than optimistic. Garrett had asked 3 careful questions about the framework before he agreed, which told her he was genuinely considering it rather than performing consideration. Isadora had asked 1, about the independence of the mediation from Iron Fang political interests, and Karina had answered it directly and without defensiveness, because the question was fair and fair questions deserved straight answers. They had left before sundown, both delegations, with the particular energy of people who had arrived carrying something they had set down and were not entirely sure yet how to walk without it. Not lightness exactly. Something more complicated than lightness. The first uncertain steps of people relearning a gait. The pack house settled into evening. The quiet that descended over Obsidian Crest in the hours after the summit concluded was unlike the quiet of the night after the blood moon ceremony. That silence had been the silence of something ending, heavy with the specific weight of consequence deferred. This was different. This was the quiet of a held breath finally, carefully released. The quiet of a room after a window has been opened, not dramatic, not transformative in any visible way, but carrying something that had not been there before. Oxygen, essentially. The simple, taken-for-granted miracle of air that moves. Karina had spent an hour with the twins after the delegations left, sitting on the floor of the guest quarters, with Zane in her lap and Rael investigating the architectural possibilities of a pair of boots someone had left by the door, and letting the day's accumulated weight move through her and out in the way that only the specific gravity of small children at a close range can facilitate. Zane had fallen asleep against her collarbone with the absolute and immediate commitment that children bring to unconsciousness, and she had sat with his weight against her chest and his breath evening out against her neck, and felt, in the particular silence of that, something she recognized as completion. Not the completion of a task, the completion of a self. Draven had appeared in the doorway after a while, taken in the scene, and settled himself against the wall nearby with a book he was almost certainly not reading. She had looked at him across the quiet room, and he had looked back, and neither of them had said anything, because nothing needed saying. That was its own form of extraordinary, when she thought about it. The luxury of a relationship that had enough room in it for silence. She transferred Zane to Draven's arms with the careful choreography of parents moving a sleeping child, and went to find water, and was in the corridor when Javier's footsteps came from the direction of the study. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped. The corridor was lit by the low evening sconces, and in that light he looked, not older exactly, but more inhabited than she remembered, as though the year had moved through him rather than simply past him, leaving its evidence in the specific way he held himself. "I watched you today," he said, not as an opening to something longer, just that, placed between them with the directness of a man who had spent a year practicing saying true things without dressing them. Karina waited. "What you built?" He stopped, considered, started again with more precision. "What you had to survive in order to have something worth using today." He held her gaze steadily. "I know what that cost. I know where the cost started." A pause. "I wanted you to know that I know." It was not an apology. They were past the architecture of apology, past the point where the word sorry could carry the weight required, past the point where either of them needed it to. This was something more specific and therefore more honest. A man bearing clear-eyed witness to a truth he had spent a long time avoiding, and offering that witness, not as a bid for anything, but simply because it was owed. Karina looked at him for a moment, at the face that had once held the power to define the entire perimeter of her world, now simply a face, recognizable, altered, belonging to a person in the ongoing and imperfect process of becoming someone better than he had been. "Thank you, Javier," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply the way you acknowledge a true thing said by someone who finally, at genuine cost, learned to say true things. One person to another. Nothing more complicated than that, and nothing less. She walked back to the guest quarters, to Draven and the twins, and the low-lit room that smelled of evening and wood smoke, and the specific, unremarkable warmth of people who belonged to each other without condition. She crossed the threshold and felt it settle over her, not like an arrival, because she had arrived a long time ago, but like a confirmation. Every road she had traveled to stand in this doorway, in this life, carrying this particular completeness. The dark ones especially, the ones that had seemed at the time like endings, had been, without exception, necessary. Every single one. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. Chapter 7. 3 weeks after Obsidian Crest, the Iron Fang compound had returned to its rhythms. The mediated boundary process had begun, 2 sessions completed, a 3rd scheduled, both delegations present, and difficult and genuine in the specific way of people who have decided to try something they aren't sure will work but have run out of convincing arguments for the alternative. Rena managed the logistics with her characteristic precision and reported progress in the careful, qualified language of someone who had been around long enough to know the difference between movement and resolution, and who considered premature optimism a form of professional negligence. Draven read her reports and asked good questions. Karina was present for the sessions themselves and said less than anyone expected, which by now everyone in both delegations had learned to understand as its own form of authority. The realm was not fixed. It was measurably and cautiously and without guarantee better. Life at the compound had the quality that Karina had come to recognize as its truest form. Not the heightened crisis-sharpened clarity of the months surrounding the summit or the Obsidian Crest visit, but the ordinary, load-bearing, deeply sustaining texture of a life that had enough room in it for Tuesday afternoons and disagreements about dinner and the specific domestic comedy of 2 14-month-olds who had recently discovered that cause and effect applied to gravity and were conducting extensive experiments on the subject from every available elevated surface. It was on one of these ordinary evenings, a Thursday, clear and cold, the autumn having arrived in full overnight and deposited itself across the compound in a layer of wood smoke and amber light, and the particular quality of darkness that came earlier now and stayed, that it happened. They were outside. No specific reason. Draven had taken the twins to the western courtyard after the evening meal in the uncomplicated way he sometimes did, simply because the night was clear and the air was good, and Zane had been pulling toward the door with the single-minded insistence of someone with a strong opinion about where he needed to be. Karina had followed with her jacket and Rael on her hip, and several members of the evening watch had drifted into proximity in the unhurried way of a pack that liked to be near its Luna and her children without requiring a formal reason. The moon was enormous. It sat above the tree line in the east, like something that had decided tonight to be impossible to ignore. Full and white and close enough that the shadows it cast were sharp-edged, the compound rendered in high contrast, every familiar surface made slightly strange by the quality of the light. Karina felt it before she saw it fully, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something atmospheric, something that moved through the body with a significance the mind was still catching up to. Zane felt it first. He went still in a way that was entirely unlike his usual stillness. Not the watchful, assessing quiet of his everyday temperament, but something deeper and older, some animal orientation that had nothing to do with the 14-month-old body it was moving through and everything to do with what was living inside it. He turned his face upward toward the moon with the slow, inexorable movement of a compass finding north. Rael, on Karina's hip, turned at exactly the same moment. The pack felt it before it happened. A collective stillness descended on the courtyard. The evening watch, the 3 wolves near the eastern wall, the 2 who had been crossing the yard with no particular urgency, all of them stopping simultaneously, oriented toward the twins with the instinctive attention of a pack whose body knew something its minds were still processing. Sable, in the doorway of the eastern corridor, where she had been standing for reasons she had not explained and no one had thought to question, tilted her head and smiled. The sound that came from Zane was not a wolf's howl. He was too young and too small, and his body had years of growing still ahead of it before it would produce the full, resonant, territory-filling sound that the Iron Fang pack raised every full moon. But it was unmistakably, undeniably, powerfully the beginning of one. A clear, rising note that came from somewhere deeper than his throat, carrying a frequency that moved through the cold autumn air and through the courtyard, and through every wolf present in a wave that registered below language and above instinct. In the register where truth lives, Rael joined him 4 seconds later. Same note, same depth, harmonizing with his brother in the effortless, instinctive way of 2 beings who had shared their first space and had never lost the frequency. The pack answered. It began with the wolf nearest the eastern wall, involuntary, immediate, his head going back before he had consciously decided anything. Then the watch, then 3 more from the compound's interior, responding to something they felt in their bones before they heard it with their ears. It moved outward through the Iron Fang territory in a wave, pack member after pack member lifting their voice to a moon that had never, in all its long history of witnessing, seen quite this particular thing before. Draven found her hand in the dark. She felt his fingers close around hers, steady, unhurried, certain in the way he was always certain. And she held on and looked up at the same moon that had watched Javier tilt her chin up with cold fingers and call her worthless in front of everyone she had ever known. The same moon, a different woman, both things true at once without contradiction, without the need to resolve the distance between them into something simpler than it was. Her sons' voices rose into the autumn sky, silver and gold, ancient and new, carrying everything she had survived to give them. She exhaled slowly into the cold air and said very quietly, to the moon, or to herself, or to the goddess who had always known exactly what she was building toward. There it is. Chapter Thaler 8. 1 year after the Summit of 3, the Iron Fang compound was loud in the best possible way. Not the loud of crisis or ceremony, not the drums of a claiming ritual or the sharp, directional noise of a pack on alert, but the specific, generous, completely ungovernable loud of a gathering that had started as a dinner and expanded in the way of evenings that are going particularly well into something larger and less scheduled than anyone had planned. The great hall's doors had been opened to the courtyard to accommodate the overflow. Someone had built the fire too high, and no one had complained. The smell of wood smoke and late harvest food, and the particular warmth of a large number of people who genuinely liked each other, occupied in the same space at the same time, moved through the autumn air like something that had been earned and knew it. Rena found Karina near the eastern wall with a cup of wine, and the expression of someone watching something they built, working exactly as intended. She stopped beside her and produced, from inside her jacket, a folded piece of correspondence that she held out with the particular satisfaction of a woman delivering news she has been looking forward to delivering since breakfast. "Third one this month," she said. "The Hartwell Border Delegation. They cited your facilitation of the Ashbourne-Velthorn process specifically? Called it—" She unfolded the letter and found the line with the precision of someone who had already read it several times. "A model of principled mediation." She refolded it. "I want it noted that I tested you with a staged negotiation in your first week here, and you took apart a senior strategist in 40 minutes. "You've noted it before," Karina said. "I'll keep noting it until it stops being satisfying," Rena said, and accepted a cup from a passing wolf with the smooth efficiency of someone who had developed the ability to conduct serious conversations and manage logistics simultaneously. She looked out at the courtyard, at the compound, at the particular quality of the evening. Something moved through her expression that was not her usual economy. Something warmer and less guarded, visible for exactly the length of time she decided to allow it. "You know I don't say things I don't mean." "I know," Karina said. "Good." Rena raised her cup briefly in the direction of nothing specific and everything general, and moved back into the gathering. Sable was in her customary position, the eastern bench, the one she had occupied on the morning she placed her hands on Karina's wrists, and found the son she had been carrying without knowing it. She was not alone. Zane was beside her, 2 years old, and already conducting what appeared to be a detailed conversation, his serious silver eyes moving between Sable's face and some point in the middle distance that only the two of them seemed able to access. Sable was listening with the full investment of her attention, nodding occasionally, interjecting in a low voice that Karina couldn't hear from across the courtyard. She did not know what they talked about in these sessions, and had learned not to ask. Some things were between a child and the elder, who could hear what he was actually saying underneath the words he had not yet learned. Rael was across the courtyard, doing something complicated with a pile of autumn leaves and the focused, joyful intensity of a person for whom the present moment was always completely sufficient. Cruz, who had arrived an hour ago from Obsidian Crest, formally as Javier's representative to the ongoing boundary process, and informally as a man who had spent 2 years quietly holding a pack together, and had been told in a letter from Draven that he had read 3 times that the Iron Fang considered him a friend of the compound, was sitting nearby, watching Rael with the expression of a man who had been carrying a great deal for a long time, and had recently been given, in small and unremarkable increments, permission to set some of it down. He had brought a message from Javier. Not political. Personal. 3 sentences, handwritten, addressed to Karina, which she had read in the corridor before the gathering, and folded and put in her pocket where it sat now, warm and specific and belonging to a correspondence that had become, over the course of a year, one of the more honest relationships she maintained. Not close, not simple, but real, in the way that things are real when 2 people have stopped pretending and started simply being truthful about the distance between them and the respect that exists inside it anyway. Draven appeared at her shoulder. He had been in the hall managing the part of a gathering that required an alpha's attention. The introductions, the acknowledgements, the particular social architecture of a compound that was growing and needed its structure tended. And he arrived beside her now with the wordless ease of a man returning to his own gravity. He looked out at the courtyard, at Zane and Sable, at Rael and the leaves and Cruz's unguarded face, at Rena working the room with her efficient warmth, at the fire burning too high and the open doors and the sound of a community that had chosen itself deliberately and kept choosing every ordinary day. He didn't say anything. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood together in the autumn evening and watched the life they had built, out of rejection and survival, and a crossing in the dark, and trials, and a marking, and twins, and a summit, and a speech, and one first howl under an enormous moon, doing what lives do when they are genuinely, completely, correctly inhabited. They live. Karina looked up at the sky above the compound. The same sky, the same stars, the same moon in its eternal and unhurried rotation, and felt the full accumulated weight of every road that had brought her to this courtyard, this evening, this specific and irreplaceable moment. She had been called worthless once in front of everyone by a man who did not have the eyes to see what he was holding. She looked at what she was holding now, and the moon goddess, who had always known, said nothing at all, because some things, when they finally arrive exactly as intended, require no commentary whatsoever. Some stories end with a battle. This one ends with a courtyard, a fire burning too high, and two silver-eyed children who stopped a war without raising a single weapon. That is not an accident. That is the point. Karina was told, in front of everyone she had ever known, that she was worthless. The cruelest part was not the words. It was that she had spent years in a world that confirmed them. She had learned to measure herself in someone else's currency, to shrink into the shape of what was wanted rather than expand into the truth of what she was. But the rejection was not the end of her story. It was the first honest sentence of it. Draven did not save her. He saw her, which is a different thing entirely and rarer. She saved herself, one impossible choice at a time. And the wounds she survived, carried honestly rather than defensively, became the most powerful thing she owned, not despite what they cost her. Because of it. The moral is this: never let the person who failed to see you write the final word on what you are. They were never qualified for that job. So here is our question. Which moment finally broke the wall in that summit room? Karina's words or her son's silver eyes? Drop your answer in the comments below. We are on a goal to 1,000 subscribers. 1 subscribe, 1 share, and we will get there together. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe right now. Karina didn't come this far for us to stop here.